and welcome to my May wrap-up, my wrap-up of Mary Shelley May and all of the reading that I did during this month. My name is Jenna, and this is Chicky Bean Loves Books. Thank you so much to everybody who commented recently on my April wrap-up and said how much they appreciate the questions and the teacup question method that I'm using for my wrap-ups. I really appreciate that. I liked hearing that you are enjoying it too. So thank you to everybody who commented. I really appreciate it. It warmed my heart. That being said, let's just dive in because we've got a lot of books to get through. First is a DNF, and that is The Girl Who Would Speak for the Dead by Paul Elwork. This is a YA. I've had it on my shelf since I think 2015, maybe earlier, and I've never read it. And I think if I had read it back then, I would have really enjoyed it. I don't think there's anything wrong with the writing. I think the writing is engaging, but it is a retelling of the story of the Fox sisters. But it's a retelling. It's the exact same series of events, but with a brother and a sister instead of two sisters. And for where I'm at in my reading and knowledge life right now, it just didn't work for me. So I'm going to pass that on. And now I have just a huge stack of nonfiction reads. First on my stack is When the Blue Goes, the poems of Robert Nash, translated by Francois Besnard-Canter. And this is translated by a woman who teaches French at the school that I work at. And she's an amazing human being. I've eaten lunch with her and she's just fun and awesome. And she happens to also be a professional translator. She speaks French as her first language, and she speaks English fluently. These poems are by a person who speaks English as their first language, but wrote all their poems in French. And so Francois has translated an English speaker's French poems back into English because she is a French speaker who speaks English. It was fascinating. The writer of these poems disappeared. Most of these poems are incredibly sad. They are also a comment on American society and a lot about loss. He just walked away one day and nobody knows what happened to him, which is fascinating to me. I had never heard of Robert Nash before, and I hadn't intended to read this, and it wasn't on my radar at all, but then Francois was talking about how she had a book coming out, and so I was like, I need to try that. So I did, and it was awesome, and I highly recommend it. Then I read She Made a Monster, which is a nonfiction children's book about Mary Shelley. This one happens to focus on the creation of the story as Mary Shelley told it in a much later preface to a copy of Frankenstein. The mythology that she created is that Frankenstein came to her in a dream when she and her friends, Byron and her sister Claire Claremont and Dr. Polidori and her husband, Percy, were all at Villa Diodate, and it was the year without a summer, and they were tired of what they were reading, and so Byron said, hey, let's challenge each other to write the scariest thing that we can. Let's entertain each other. And she couldn't think of a story, and then, it came to her in a dream. The issue with that is that she created that mythology for several reasons. We know it's mythology because Dr. Polidori, who was probably in love with Byron and with Mary Shelley, kept a meticulous journal. And in his journal, he writes very clearly that Mary Shelley sits down to work right away. Like that challenge is given and she just sits down to start writing. She is not in any way hindered by writer's block or anything like that. And perhaps she did have a dream, but also the reason why she might have created that was several fold. For one thing, during the Romantic period, dreams, they could foretell things, but they only really came to the special people. The special people had these kinds of insightful dreams. And so she's kind of giving herself laying on herself a special anointing, right? But at the same time, she's also validating that a woman wrote that story. She can't be held accountable for the vileness of the tale coming from fragile female mind, because it came to her in a dream. And it came to her in a dream because she was chosen. It's a very interesting mythology. None of that is in this book. That's just what I know from other study about Mary Shelley's life. This book focuses on the challenge being set, the dream coming, and it's not the smoothest storytelling, especially when I consider it in light of the other children's book that I read about her life, which was this one. Through the Tempest, Dark and Wild, a story of Mary Shelley, creator of Frankenstein, by Sharon Darrow and Angela Barrett. First of all, this has the most beautiful pictures in it. You can see me reflected. I'm just gonna put it down. But I read that book and it was so good. It focuses on establishing Mary Shelley as a troubled individual who feels a little bit isolated because of difficult relationships with her stepmother and her father's inability to pay bills, etc., and how she kind of gets shipped off to Scotland to stay with, she gets shipped off to stay with a devotee of her father, someone who just randomly writes her father a letter saying, I really appreciate your anarchic, stance on life. And so her father's, and the man offers to do anything for him, like, if there's anything I can ever do. And so Godwin is like, you could take my daughter. Luckily, it's a really good time for her, and she makes lifelong friends who kind of abandon her because of things. She does have a really great experience of what family life would be like, and she does make really solid friendships who do abandon her when she makes decisions to buck society's expectations. Mary Shelley does not in any way live a Jane Austen kind of Regency life, although she's living in the Regency period. She does reside staunchly within that romantic era and that romantic mindset, because she falls in love with Percy Shelley, because her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, proto-feminist #1, and because her father is William Godwin, the father of anarchy. So it is no surprise that Mary Shelley bucks tradition, runs away with a married man when she's just a child, lives a free love lifestyle to please him, although it does not please her, studies science and politics and all sorts of things. She is who she is because of who she is. And it's really funny that all the people in her life who are in her life because of her mother and her father and her husband really kind of separate themselves from her when she starts to live out the ideals that they say they support. It's just very interesting. Father, for a long time, disowns her because she runs away with Percy. A lot of that is the influence of the stepmother, who is part of the reason why she gets sent to Scotland in the first place, which is why we have this amazing children's book, which covers so much of this in such an appropriate way. It does an amazing job of sharing how the person who created Frankenstein was just the right person to create Frankenstein. It is truly a love letter to Mary Shelley, so I recommend that to adults and children alike. Then I finished this one. This is a rollover from my April TBR. Finished it. This is Molly Peacock's The Paper Garden. An artist begins her life's work at 72, and I absolutely loved this. This is a memoir of the author, who is a poet. Molly Peacock is a poet. I've never read their poetry, but I will remedy that now. And it is also a biography of Mary Delaney, who lived a life that really mirrors or takes you through, shows you the role of women in the 1700s. It was tough going to be a girl. She gets married off to a gross old man, basically sold by her uncle. She gets sent to live with her uncle, even though she has a very loving family, and she never blames her parents for any of the things that happened to her, which is really interesting because really it's their doing. But is it really their doing? Because it's also like the way their society worked. But it just goes into these things, and it shows you through her art that she creates decades later, after the death of her second husband, who she really loved, shows you how she incorporates all her life experience into these paper flower collages that she makes. And she's really the woman who created collaging in this fashion. I also read Our Story, a memoir of love and life in China by Rao Pingru. This is a memoir and a graphic novel of the love story between Rao and the woman who becomes his wife, but it is also a love story to China. The China that was before the revolution. This is just a beautiful, beautiful book in so many ways. It's beautiful in the drawings that he does, but it's also beautiful in the storytelling and the heart and just the gloriousness of it. And I just want to end, I know I started with this when I did my TBR, but I just want to end with images of them. Like, this is the author as a youth, and this is the woman he fell in love with. And then this is the author in old age and the woman he fell in love with. And it's just a soft, gentle, honest life story, but that also details one of the most revolutionary upheavals in an ancient society that we have access to. It was beautiful. I read Selected Letters of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, edited by Betty T. Bennett. Betty T. Bennett is a superstar. The detail with which she adds editorial information to these letters, which really creates cohesion between them, is amazing. And I have to say, I walked away feeling like I know Mary Shelley as a person. I know how fickle she could be, how a little bit manipulative and conniving she could be, how a little bit selfish she could be, but also how devoted she was and how manipulated she was by others, how much she tried to please Percy, how Percy manipulated her. It was really, really fascinating, and they're just her letters with this amazing backwork by Betty T. Bennett. This is one of the best selected letter collections of a famous person that I've ever read. I read Julia Hart's memoir, Brazen. First off, this is a book that I picked up because I watched, it's mentioned here, the Netflix series, My Unorthodox Life, which is a reality series about her and her family. And she is a massive shoe designer. She's super influential in the fashion world. But she grew up when I watched the Netflix series, I thought she'd grown up in Muncie, which is an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in New York. She fascinated me. I was like, how does a woman go from a restrictive life like that to being just this huge fashion mogul, really? So I wanted to read her biography or her memoir. She's so intelligent. She's incredibly intelligent. She was born in Russia. Her family immigrated to Texas. They converted. They were Jewish already, but they converted to ultra-Orthodox Judaism. She was raised ultra-Orthodox. Her mother became obsessive after a terrible accident. And she is so intelligent and has had glimpses of the outside world, although she is very devoted and has a strict, even now, a very rich religious belief system, Jewish belief system. But she doesn't question the scripture or God. She questions the systems that rabbis, that people, that men in particular have created, and the ways in which they're used to oppress not only women, but people. But she's a woman, so she focuses on the female perspective. It's like a coming of age story twice over, and how she has to carefully maneuver these systems so that she can have a successful business, how she really learns to have a successful business because she's incredibly naive and she makes so many mistakes just by trusting people. And then also how she has to maneuver the system so that she doesn't lose her children. And it's a fascinating memoir. It's absolutely fascinating, and in no way, although it is extremely honest and does cast judgment on some pretty horrifying practices and expectations, it in no way is like a tell-all. This is truly her memoir. And I think that the cover of the book and the name of the book make it feel like a Desperate Housewives or a Housewives of New Jersey sort of feel, which I love watching the Housewives of New Jersey. That's not a judgment, but that's a definite like way of showing a culture. That's not what this book is. This book is this woman's life and her experience living that life. Her life's not over, right? She's still young and she's still vibrant, and she's still creating, and she's still growing, and she's still in relationships with all of these people who she's writing about in the book. And so you really want to know, like, where is she going to find that significant moment to end the way she's telling her story now? I found the whole process fascinating. How incredibly intelligent she is makes the reading experience so insightful, both historically, philosophically, the way that she is able to explain to you the Jewish Orthodox life, and how it's obvious how much love she has for so much of that life, but also how impossible it has been made to succeed at. Just fascinating. L.E.L., The Lost Life and Scandalous Death of Letitia Elizabeth Landon, the celebrated female Byron. Fascinating. Oh my goodness. But also dense. Lucasta Miller doesn't mess around. Like, this is a dense book, and it goes into so much depth. I loved not only the telling of Letitia's life story, but the analysis of her poetry, and also her place, the context of her life, the way that so many of the authors that we know and love that have stood the test of time influenced by her. And we don't know that influence because she herself has very much kind of disappeared from the face of literature because of her scandalous life. And her scandalous life is definitely, she's got a little Carolyn Lamb in her. She's promiscuous, and she is daring, and she doesn't follow the strictures of society, but we're talking like she's living in the time of Mary Shelley, and Mary and Percy Shelley and their crew truly practiced free love, right? And yes, they were judged, and yes, they were run out of England. They had to live in Europe for such a long time, and they were not welcome in the finer rings of society, but they were also honored. And it's a little bit the same for Letitia, but at the same time, she's also really manipulated by people. And the book makes that case very clearly. It also uncovers some things that a lot of people didn't know about her in her own lifetime, like she was the mother of 3 children who she was not allowed to raise because they were all born illegitimately, and the father, who was a very well-known editor of a very well-known magazine, not Charles Dickens or Wilkie Collins, don't worry about that, they're fine, but of an equally successful and well-known editor of a literary magazine at the time, was basically using her. The term that Lucasta Miller keeps using is Svengali, and I see that strongly. And she is incredibly forward. It doesn't solve the mystery. The mystery goes unsolved, but it does create of how she died. Was she killed? Was it an overdose? Was it an accident? Did she choose suicide? But it does present a plausible possibility. And it also brings Letitia into the forefront. So here we go with the questions. Although I am going to say, I'm not going to pull a question for this one. Let me just share this one with you. This is Frankenstein by Ludwurst Bemonster, and it is a monstrous parody. It is not only a parody of Frankenstein, but of the Madeline books. And it is very well done, and it is delightful, and I highly recommend that maybe around Halloween you pick this up and read it with your young ones, and a little bit disturbing. That out of the way, let's talk about A Precious Daughter by Diane Allen. I'm going to pull a question. The question is, which character did you like the least? All right, so which character did I like the least? So the basic premise of this book, it's historical fiction, and it tells the story of a family that moved to the Yukon to strike it rich. They're from England, Scotland, they're from Great Britain. I say that hesitantly because the father is from England and the mother is from Scotland. And so they move there to the Yukon in the dead of winter to strike it rich in the gold mines. And very early on, and I think it says it in the back, the mother gets typhoid and dies. So that all happens the same day that the father strikes it rich. There's a lot of coincidences in this book. And so the daughter and the father get to leave the Yukon with a tidy sum, but no mother. And they return to England, where they try to make it in England with a dairy farm and some other relationships, which I won't go into, so that you can read them yourself and enjoy them. This was a fine historical fiction read, fine historical romance. The whole time, Amy has been keeping in contact with her mother's parents, her grandparents in Scotland, a boy at a neighboring farm there that she loved. Her father is my least favorite character. He's not intentionally awful, but he's pretty awful. He's not abusive or anything like that, but he's just really destructive in his decisions. He's also not rendered extremely believably. For example, in the beginning of the book, he goes through all of the hardship to get his family to the Yukon in the dead of winter. And it's not easy to get from Scotland to the Yukon in the dead of winter and to set up your family there, with a wife and a teenage girl and all of your stuff. I mean, it takes a lot of grit, a lot of gumption, a lot of drive, a lot of commitment. But within, the first afternoon of not finding anything because the ground is too frozen, he wants to give up and go home. That just doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't make sense at all, character-wise. There's a lot of that with the father in the book. So there's a lot of reasons to, the author gives you a lot of reasons to dislike him. I read The Wollstonecraft Detective Agency, The Case of the Missing Moonstone by Jordan Stratford and Kelly Murphy. And can I just show you some of the art of Ms. Kelly Murphy? The book is full of these full-page pen and ink drawings that are so wonderful. They just add so much to the text. And I fell in love with this series, and I'm going to read the rest of the books in this series. The basic premise is that plays with time and space a little bit, but it makes Lord Byron's daughter and Mary Shelley similar in age. So Lord Byron's daughter was Ada Lovelace. She marries a man and her last name becomes Lovelace. I don't know how to say it. Who is famously known for, we say now, creating the computer or whatever. But she really created an automated system for weaving. And it is like a computer. But it's amazing, and it's because she's such a great mathematician. And in this book, she is a teenager and Mary Shelley is a teenager, and they end up being put together, and they decide they're going to create a anonymous detective agency, and they're going to solve crimes. And they put an ad in the paper and they get a response. They choose a crime to solve. And that's what the whole book is about. And it's wonderful and delightful. You can also read it, and I don't know if this is based on fact, but the character of Ada in this book is definitely on the spectrum, and it's handled really beautifully, and they're both highly intelligent. They're both really good for each other. They balance each other out, these two girls, and it's a great relationship, a great friendship, and there's all sorts of really fun Easter eggs, like a young Charles Dickens playing a prank on the streets, things like that. Just really, really, really wonderful. Happy times. Loved it. Loved the mystery. Of course, the mystery was pretty easily solvable by an adult mind. These are middle grade books, but I'm here for the entire series. So let's answer a question about it. Did this book remind you of any other books that you've read? Describe the connection. As I was reading it, I definitely thought of a movie, actually, that I watched when I was younger called Young Sherlock Holmes. And it reminded me of that. The feeling was kind of the same as far as setting and tone. It definitely reminded me of biographies I've read about both of these young women, and it reminded me a little bit of the Enola Holmes books, although I would say that this is for a younger audience and there's a lot more humor in this than in the Enola Holmes books. I read Matilda by Mary Shelley. This is a novella. I'm going to pick a question and then answer it. What 3 songs come to mind when you think about this book? Ooh, okay, this is going to take a while. Let's see. 3 songs that come to mind when I think about Matilda. So let me give you the basic premise. This is a novella, and this may sound shocking to you, but it was a pretty common theme at the time to write about. It is a book about incest. Now, before you get totally disgusted and decide to write off Mary Shelley forever. The incest is simply that a father who has been separated from his daughter for the first 16 years of her life comes back into her life and has romantic feelings for his daughter. They are not acted upon. They both feel terrible about it. They separate. So that is the incest. That is the whole of the incest. But it really ruins her life. There's collateral damage, I'll say. There's collateral damage from the father confessing these feelings, which he's been fighting. He has not been giving into these feelings at all, but because he's been fighting them, his demeanor towards her has changed. And she demands to know what she has done to make him pull away from her. And so finally he feels kind of bullied into confessing how he feels, and it just ruins everything for both of them. The question is, what 3 songs? I think I'd go with, hang on, let me get my computer. I think I'd go with Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. I took my love and I took it down. I climbed a mountain and I turned around and I saw my reflection in the snow-covered hills till the landslide brought me down. Oh, the mirror in the sky, what is love? Can the child within my heart rise above? Can I sail through the night's changing ocean tides? Can I handle the seasons of my life? I've been afraid of changing because I've built my life around you. But time makes you bolder. Even children get older, and I'm getting older too. I think that really, there are so many ways that matches up with this story without me telling you what the story is. So definitely Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. I might go with Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor. Not the whole song, but so the tone of the song you are probably familiar with is about a breakup, right? And the effects of it in the long term. So the lyrics are, it's been 7 hours and 15 days since you took your love away. I go out every night and sleep all day since you took your love away. Since you've been gone, I can do whatever I want. I can see whomever I choose. I can eat my dinner in a fancy restaurant, but nothing can take away these blues because nothing compares to you. Nothing compares to you. It's been so lonely without you here, like a bird without a song. Nothing can stop these lonely tears from falling. Tell me, where did I go wrong? I could put my arms around every boy I see, but they'd only remind me of you. I went to the doctor and guess what he told me? He said, girl, you better try to have fun no matter what you do, but he's a fool because nothing compares to you. Again, that fits so perfectly. So definitely Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor. And then the next one that just popped into my head is Don't Stand So Close to Me by The Police. So this one is obviously about a teacher, but the chorus really fits that whole don't stand so close to me. Temptation, frustration, so bad it makes me cry. It's no use, he sees her, he starts to shake and cough, just like the old man in the book by Nabokov. Yeah, so that feeling of desiring what one cannot have. Or should not have. So I will go with Don't Stand So Close to Me by The Police, Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor, and Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. Those are the 3 songs that come to mind when I think about Matilda. I read and hated While Justice Sleeps by Stacey Abrams. And I am going to be the first one to admit that I probably hated this mostly because, wow, I really don't like political thrillers, but let's talk about it. I'm going to pull a question. The question is, how might you have written it differently? Okay, it's a political thriller and it's about what happens if a sitting judge on the Supreme Court goes into a coma. Can you replace them, etc.? And then there's intrigue around this whole situation. So how would I have written it differently? It's incredibly jumpy. It's so jam-packed full of stuff, and yet it moves so slowly. So I think the first thing that I would change, and the only thing I'll mention right now, is pacing. Also, I would not write a political thriller. That is not my thing. Next, let's talk about Bravely by Maggie Stiefvater? Vader? I don't know. The author of The Raven Cycle. So I knew that this was a continuation of the story from the cartoon Brave. And I just think the book is just so glorious. And I love The Raven Cycle by this author. And so I thought that an older character from Brave, what's her name? Merida, an older Merida, written by the author of The Raven Cycle, would have some depth to it and some intrigue and some awesomeness. I was wrong. It just reads like that cartoon all over again, but with slight variations. And the cartoon is fine, but I wanted a real book, and I got fan fiction. And it doesn't even feel like it's written by the author of The Raven Cycle at all. So I struggled with this one. I will keep it though, because that is one of my favorite covers of all time. It's so gorgeous. But let's answer a question about this book. So the question is, if this book were a food, what food would it be? So you know how you go to the grocery store and you see those slices of cake, and they just look so decadent, and then you go to eat it and the frosting is too sickeningly sweet and the cake itself tastes like sawdust. It's a piece of grocery store cake that looks real pretty, that tastes real gross. And I read just the second novella. So this is a bind up of all three of the novellas in Nnedi Okorafor's Binti series, and I loved it so much, but I decided to not read the third one right now and to pick it to read at a later date. So I read Home in this one. Let's out. Did I reread any passages? If so, which ones? I did reread the ending of the first novella before I went into the second novella. In general, if you're not familiar with this series, you should be. You should get familiar. This author's writing is absolutely phenomenal. Binti is the main character, and this is set in the future. It's a sci-fi trilogy story. And in the first one, she is on a ship going to university. And going to university is not something that her particular culture values. And so she is the only one of her culture amid a sea of people from another culture who look down on her culture. Her culture is very grounded, grounds-based, spiritual, valuing supernatural spiritual powers, kind of. And she, not intellect, but heart, kind of, and intuition. But she's also incredibly intelligent, and she wants to go to university, and she wants to develop both of these skills. But her spaceship is hijacked by another species, and she's the only one that survives the attack and the takeover because of who she is. And her experience with them changes her intellectually and emotionally, but also physically. In Home, she is having to return to her people and her culture and her place, a changed woman by the influence of her relationships, like the new knowledge that she has, and her physical change and her relationships with the individuals from this other species. How she's basically not welcomed home, that the prophet is not welcome in their own, home, their own land, kind of how this story is going. I don't know where it's going to end up going in that third and final novella, but these books have so much heart, and I'm not a huge science fiction reader. I've only just really gotten into fantasy, and I'm not into high fantasy at all. I want books that are about people, and this sci-fi series is all about people. Even though some of the people aren't like human people, they're still people. And I love this series so much, and I love this author's writing so much, and I'm looking forward to reading more from this author when I've finished Binti. I read and watched A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is my Shakespeare comedy pick for the month. Definitely not my first read of that one, but would you consider... Sometimes I feel like the Teacup knows. So the question is, would you consider teaching this book in a middle or high school classroom? And of course I picked that for A Midsummer Night's Dream, not Binti, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah, I would. I have. It has not been my favorite, but for whatever reason, reading it and watching the 1960s production with Helen Mirren was, among others, was such a revitalizing experience for me with this play. I found humor in it that I had lost. I had kind of reduced it. I'd been doing a reductionist reading of it. Seeing that performance really changed the way that I viewed some of these character relationships, and the chase through the forest gave it such a lighthearted feel that I had lost for this play. So kudos to the 1960s production and to BBC for letting me watch it. I just absolutely had the greatest time with this play, and I haven't had such a great time with it in such a long time. Favorite Shakespeares to teach middle and high school are Hamlet and Macbeth. My favorite Shakespeares personally are Titus Andronicus, Macbeth, and Measure for Measure. I enjoy others, but those are my personal favorites. Now I feel like I need to add this one back to the list because I just really felt like I was reading a new story. I would consider teaching this again. I haven't wanted to teach it in such a long time, but I would consider teaching it again. Let's pick the next question to go with They Do It With Mirrors by Agatha Christie, which I thought was so dark, so dark, and so much fun. Did reading the book impact your mood? If yes, how so? So I've started doing this thing where I read my Miss Marples in one go. I'll pick a Saturday or a Sunday morning and just sit down to read it. They usually take me about 2.5 to 3 hours. And I really, really find that I get so much more out of them when I do it that way. And then later that same weekend, I will watch the Marple production of it, the hour-and-a-half movie or whatever. And they're always different. The Marple TV show changes things from the books. So they're different enough to enjoy, but also I get some insight into the way that somebody else would develop the characters. This is about a murder, of course, a couple of murders actually, that happen at the home of a socialite woman who her and her, I don't know, fifth husband or something, are trying to run a delinquent rehabilitation program on their property. There's been some murders and there are some interesting relationships going on. And of course, Miss Marple has to figure out who did it and is it related to the people who they're trying to rehabilitate. It was great. It was great. What mood did it give me, or did it change my mood? I get really pumped when I read these. Like I feel intelligent, but I also feel challenged and amused and humored. Miss Marple just gets funnier and funnier. I'm not going to say that this has usurped A Murder Is Announced. I really loved A Murder Is Announced, but I love them each so much, and this is no exception. I do feel like this one took a step into darkness that the others hadn't done yet, and that shocked me a little bit, but in a good way. I read By the Book by Jasmine Gilroy. This is the second in the Meant to Be series that is being produced by Disney's Hyperion imprint. The first one was If the Shoe Fits, which I read last December, and really, really enjoyed. That one was by Julie Murphy of Dumplin fame. This is by the author of The Wedding Date, The Proposal, While We Were Dating, The Wedding Party, Party for Two, Royal Holiday. You know this author. Well, she has written the next book in the Meant to Be series by Disney's Hyperion imprint. And this one is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. And it was just a joy. It was so lighthearted and clean, totally closed door, totally like any age can read this and enjoy it. And there were lots of Easter eggs for people who really, really love the Disney cartoon version of Beauty and the Beast. Let's answer a question about it. What did I think of the ending? Well, I mean, the ending is pretty prescribed. So what this book does is it takes the story of Beauty and the Beast. The Beast is a cantankerous person who's supposed to be writing his memoir. He's a famous person. He's supposed to be writing his memoir. And the editor, who ends up coming to kind of get him to write because he's not submitting any chapters, and how she decides, or he invites her to just kind of move into his mansion for a while during this process. So he is the Beast and she is Beauty. The ending is a happy one for all involved. So, I mean, how do I feel about the ending? It was expected. If I hadn't gotten it, I think I would have been outraged. Frankenstein! Of course, this was Mary Shelley May. Great. Thank you to everybody who decided to take part in Mary Shelley May with me. I had a blast and I loved rereading this. I think rereading it so close to my fresh first reading of Matilda and of her letters really impacted what I saw in the reading this time around, and I really focused on motherhood this time around. Let's pull a question about Frankenstein. I don't think I need to give a synopsis about Frankenstein. What did I think of the writing? Are there any standout sentences? I love the writing. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and there are huge standout passages, but I will read just maybe one paragraph. This is from Volume 2, Chapter 1 of the 1819 edition of this. That's the first print. And it says, and I say that only because, she makes significant edits to later editions of the book. So sometimes it feels very different to read the later edition than to read the 1819 original edition. So Chapter 1, Volume 2, in my version, page 69, the first paragraph says, "Nothing is more painful to the human mind than after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows, and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died, she rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description horrible, and more, much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions, and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience, which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures, such as no language can describe." I love this book, Frankenstein. I read Spring Magic by D.E. Stevenson, and let's answer a question about it. What was my favorite chapter and why? I don't know that I have a favorite chapter, but this book is about a girl, what's her name? Frances Field. This book is about Frances Field, who has basically been orphaned and is living with her aunt and uncle in London. And she has kind of been indentured to her aunt and uncle. She just runs all the errands. She's a little bit Cinderella-ish. She runs all the errands and she's obedient and she does all the things that she's supposed to do, to the point where her aunt feels like she doesn't have to live life anymore. So she gets sick and has to stay on the couch eating chocolate bonbons and reading romance novels. And the doctor comes and says, "You know what, Frances, you really should take a vacation." And they're trying to get, World War II is happening, and they're trying to get the aunt to move to the country to get away from the air raids. But the aunt doesn't think the air raids will ever touch her, but then one falls in a park really close by and rattles the windows and she gets scared. And so as they're making preparations to go to the country to get out of London, Frances says, "You know what? I think I'm going to take the doctor's advice and I'm going to take a vacation." And so she does. She goes to Cairn. She's always wanted to go to Cairn in the Scottish Highlands, and she doesn't know why. She saw a picture of it in a book once. She doesn't know anything else about it, but she was drawn to it. And there's military people stationed there. And so she finds herself kind of getting an education in life, basically, because she's lived such a sheltered life. She gets this education, from making friends with and living alongside the soldiers and their wives. And there's some scandal and all sorts of stuff that happens. But if you liked Lolly Willows, I suggest this. There's no one selling their soul to the devil or anything like that in this one, but the feeling is kind of the same, of independence coming to a woman who's been enslaved by social expectations. If you loved The Blue Castle, I suggest you read this. I don't have necessarily a favorite chapter in that book, but the whole story is delightful and I recommend it. This was the choice for my In Real Life book club. This was The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper. It's the first book in a trilogy about the women of Pompeii. So let's answer a question. Would you ever consider rereading it? Why or why not? It's a really hard book to read, for one thing. It is about the life and trials of a brothel of women, of prostitutes, of slaves who were purchased to be prostitutes in Pompeii in roughly 75 to 79 AD. So Vesuvius erupts in 79, and this is taking place close to that time period, I believe. So I'm guessing the 70s AD. There are some names that you might recognize, like Pliny the Elder, but for the most part, these are just average prostitutes in Pompeii. It's very well researched. I went down a deep dive, wanting context, trying to find contextual place to lay this is head, because I've never read anything that takes place in Pompeii before. And I found I've watched several documentaries, but most of them are about the eruption of Vesuvius, obviously, or they're about the archaeological excavation. But I found a great documentary by Mary Beard, who, of course, is the author of SPQR, who is like living expert of Roman times. This documentary was so insightful. So this book, I'm going to connect those two things, this book and that documentary here in a second. But this book, it's very well researched, and it is about the brothel culture, the prostitute culture that many historians and travel guides will teach you was the probable resort town, like Las Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas sort of lifestyle that the Pompeians were used to. And we've based this on several things, like an abundance of penis art, and penis street signs, and murals depicting prostitute offerings, etc. And then also just knowing Roman culture and their relationship to sex and sexual deviance. But I watched this documentary with Mary Beard, and she's like, we're making too big a deal out of these things that we see. Like, this is just about Roman virilence, like establishing the male need to establish themselves as superior. That's why we see all of this erotic art, and that, it's not like there's as many brothels in Pompeii as there are Starbucks in Seattle. It's not like that. That we are getting that wrong, and that it's not any more of a focus than it would have been in Rome, which really helped me to be able to read this because these women's lives are rough. I don't doubt this is a fairly accurate representation of what a prostitute's life, or what an average woman, because there are also average women here, but I don't doubt that it is an accurate representation. But to think that the entire city of Pompeii was just filled with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women who were having this experience really bummed me out. So if that were the case, I would have to say, no, I don't want to reread this, but I will read the other two books. This is a trilogy, so I will read the other two books as they're released, because I need to know what happens to these women. Like, I'm totally invested in these women and their lives and their situation. And there's a huge thing that happens at the end of this one, and I need to know if Amara can process it. I need to know how it's going to affect her. But it also helped me to understand Mary Beard's perspective on Pompeii, and to know that, yes, this is the experience of some, but not many, was really helpful for me. So I liked this. It's very sparse. The writing is very sparse and straightforward and gritty. And if you have any trigger issues, I suggest you look them up. There are many, many, many things in here that I assume would trigger many people. Read with caution, but also definitely pick this book up if you are interested in history or women or characterization, character development, or reading about something that you probably don't know a whole lot about. I definitely didn't know a whole lot about this, and I consider myself to be fairly well read. And so this was just really a unique reading experience for me, and I do recommend it. Would I reread it? I do think that there could be an instance where I reread it. I definitely want to keep it, and I definitely want to read the next two books, but it's also a really, really hard thing to read about. The Far Pavilions. This was my Beans Big Book Bash pick for the month. It was a joy, an absolute joy to read. Let's look at a question. Would you want to read another book by this author? Yes. In fact, I have Shadow of the Moon on my shelf right now, on my TBR shelf. I have read Shadow of the Moon before, but I was 16 or 17 years old. It was a long time ago, and I don't actually remember if I finished reading it or not. It's a chunker as well. So yes, I would totally read other books by this author. I have already recorded and uploaded, yay me, my discussion about the Far Pavilions. So I won't say any more about the Far Pavilions here. You can watch that if you're curious. Next, I have The Catcher in the Rye. I have 2 copies of The Catcher in the Rye because this is my well-used, well-read, well-loved copy that I used to teach from. Wonder and Gloriousness, which are annotations, but I wanted a new one, and so I got this one, which is a larger size and now only has 1 reading's worth of annotations in it. I love this book so much. This is definitely one of my favorite books of all time. Answer a question about The Catcher in the Rye. Would you have ended the book differently? Did it end the way you thought it would? So, if you haven't read Catcher in the Rye yet, the ending. So the basic premise of this book, if you're not familiar, is about a boy in the 50s who is 15 or 16 years old, who leaves his boarding school. He's going to be kicked out anyway. So he leaves his boarding school and goes and spends a night wandering around New York. But while doing so, he also kind of talks you through and shares with you, the reader, some abuse and some neglect that he has gone through in his life. You get to meet his sister, who he'd like to protect with all his heart, from having to deal with these rougher parts of life that have been part of his experience. He's really embittered about the way life seems to be for him. He's concerned about the inauthenticity of most people that he meets, knowing that he himself is also inauthentic. He's inauthentic as a protection mechanism, but he feels that the people around him are inauthentic because they have nefarious purposes. And this is the ending. It says, that's all I'm going to tell about. I could probably tell you what I did after I went home and how I got sick and all, and what school I'm supposed to go to next fall after I get out of here. Here is a mental institution. But I don't feel like it. I really don't. That stuff doesn't interest me too much right now. A lot of people, especially this one psychoanalyst guy they have here, keeps asking me if I'm going to apply myself when I get back to school next September. It's such a stupid question, in my opinion. I mean, how do you know what you're going to do till you do it? The answer is you don't. I think I am, but how do I know? I swear it's a stupid question. So in the end, he takes his sister to ride on a carousel, and he feels happy, and it's raining. He's, being baptized by the rain, basically, symbolically. And he's got his hunting hat on, which he's always wearing, which protects him a little bit from the rain, but really it can't stop him from, his comfort object can't stop him from experiencing difficulty or change. But he's watching his sister on this merry-go-round, and he feels happy. He feels happy because he's seeing his sister, and things will happen, but the world keeps going round. The world keeps going round. He sees some hope. And then that passage that I read to you, is the end of his journal that he's kind of been asked to write by his psychoanalyst. And in it, I think that I read it as very hopeful, because you've got this kid who's dealing with a lot of unknowns, who's just kind of accepting these unknowns. He really wants to protect his sister from all the things that he himself has been through, but he can't. He doesn't have any control. And so that idea of I think it's really stupid to ask me if I'm going to apply myself, because how do I know what I'm going to do until I do it, is really his processing of all of the things that he's afraid will happen. So he can't promise to protect his sister or himself, because he doesn't know what will happen. He doesn't know what the things are that will be acted against him, or how he will act in response. And so he takes a little of the pressure off of himself in that. And I should probably just record an entire video about this, because I know I'm doing a terrible job of explaining to you why the ending is so beautiful and hopeful, and why I would not change a thing about it. But that's just a little tiny insight into my reading of the book. All right, I read Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Sugimura. This is the prize-winning Japanese #1 bestseller, and it's also been like a darling on all the bookish media, and I did not enjoy it. It pains me to say it, but it's true. Here we go. The question is, who was my favorite character and why? I'm gonna go with Kokoro. Kokoro is a girl who kind of starts the story for us because she has some anxiety issues and she doesn't go to school. She's been through some rough stuff at her previous school. Her parents found her a much more relaxed, laid-back school where she can kind of get some counseling as well and re-enter society and deal with her anxiety issues, her PTSD. But she's supposed to start that school at the beginning of the book, and she wakes up with a stomach ache and says she can't go to school. And while at home, her mirror kind of comes to life and she walks through it into an alternate reality, a castle in the mirror. And there, eventually she will meet a lot of other people and a girl with a wolf mask on who tells them a couple of really important things. For one thing, they can't stay in the castle after a certain time because that's when the wolves come out and they will be eaten. They will be killed. That there is an object that they all need to be looking for, and if they find it and use it, then one of them will get a wish granted. That if any of them break any of the rules that she goes over with them, if one of them breaks the rule, then the consequences for all of them. If one of them stays late, then the consequences for all of them. It's an interesting concept, but it lacked flow. I never felt engaged with it. I never forgot that I was reading. It was a conscious choice to continue to read on every time I picked up the book. It was confusing at times, unnecessarily. The pacing was weird. At no point did this book make me care about any of these characters. And I really don't understand the hype behind this book, except that, of course, it is gorgeous. And except that, of course, the ultimate message is quite good. But I think it could have been a short story, and it probably would have been more powerful. The Magnolia Palace by Fiona Davis. I love Fiona Davis. I read all the Fiona Davises. What did you like the most about this book? What did you like the least? Magnolia Palace is a dual timeline book with two main characters who are acting independently, obviously, because they're in two different time periods, but they affect each other. Well, the past affects the present character. All Fiona Davis books are like this. She has a formula that she uses, but they're also really historically rich. And this one is about the Frick family and the Frick mansion. It's also, one of the characters, the first character we meet, was what I loved most about this book. That is the character of Lillian, correct? Yeah, Lillian Carter is what I liked most about this book. She is a model, and she's kind of fallen from grace. She comes home to realize that her kind of disgusting landlord has killed his wife, which was an actual event, but Lillian is not a real character. She's held suspect by the police, and she runs. She escapes through the window, and she ends up at the Frick mansion, where she's offered a job through a series of events to be a personal secretary to the daughter of Mr. Frick. And she has great influence over the collection of art that is created there through that. But she's only there for 3 months, but a lot of things happen. And then the present day character, Veronica Weber, is a British model who finds herself in New York doing a photo shoot, but she's got a lot of other things going on. And the photo shoot is happening in the Frick mansion. And that character in that storyline was a lot less interesting to me. However, the way that Fiona Davis melds the two together was, as always, excellent. Then there is The Children on the Hill by Jennifer McMahon. This is a retelling of Frankenstein. It deals with eugenics and mad scientists and children and ghost hunters and monsters and mysterious disappearances. The question is, what surprised you most about the book? So this one also has a dual timeline. And what surprised me most about the book is the big reveal. So basic premise, in one timeline you have a sister and a brother and a third child being raised on the grounds of a psychiatric hospital that the grandmother of the sister and the brother runs. And so the kids live in her home, and then another mysterious child is added to the mix because she's a psychiatric patient, but she can't live in the psychiatric ward because she's too young. All of the other patients are adults. So the grandmother takes her into their own home. The storyline of these kids is the past, and of this hospital and of this grandmother. And then in the present, one of these kids has become a monster hunter. She has you know those shows, those ghost hunter shows, which I love, but you know those ghost hunter shows on TV. She has one of those and a podcast, and she goes around the country looking for monsters. What surprised me was the big reveal. She's hunting for a particular monster, and who and what that monster turns out to be really surprised me. I had no idea. I had no inkling. The Mary Shelley Club, I read. This is by Goldie Moldavsky. What 3 works of art come to mind when you think about this book? Okay, so The Mary Shelley Club is a YA thriller, which I really enjoyed. I was surprised. And I ended up reading it in about 4 hours on Friday afternoon after I got home from work. I couldn't stop. I voraciously consumed this beast. This is the story of a girl who something happens to her and her family relocates, her and her mom relocate, and she's trying to make friends at a new school, but she's got some PTSD stuff going on from something that happened to her. She ends up becoming part of a group of people called the Mary Shelley Club who are obsessed with horror films and practical jokes and holding peers accountable for things. And it's not a good vibe. And there's a big mystery, and it's a thriller, and there's, it's all tied to things that happened to her beforehand that kind of led to her being in this new community, but it's also tied to this community itself. Yeah, it's excellent. So what 3 works of art? I'm on my computer and I'm looking, and I'm drawn initially to work by people from the Romantic period. Of course, the first thing that popped into my mind was the French painting The Desperate Man by Gustave Courbet. I'll put that here. But this, I think, is an obvious choice because it's often associated with Frankenstein, with Dr. Frankenstein. But that is there. That is The Desperate Man. So that's one that came into my mind. Also, pretty much any of the work of Caspar David Friedrich, who is a contemporary of Mary Shelley, who was a German painter and is one of my absolute favorite painters. So I'll put this one up, Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, but it's not necessarily the one that stands out to me, but it's the one you're probably familiar with. Caspar David Friedrich paintings, but the one that I'm really thinking about when I think of this book is Moonrise Over the Sea. And this, I keep picking these like romantic period paintings, but know that the book is very contemporary. It is not set in the past. It's not historical fiction at all. But for whatever reason, it's the tone or the vibe of these paintings. And then also, we all know Edvard Munch for The Scream, which is this painting here, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. I'm actually thinking of this one, which is called The Kiss, which reminds me also, and I'll give you an extra, of this one, which is also called The Kiss by Gustav Klimt. Both of those, I think, fit when considering that book. And then I read The Sisters Weiss by Naomi Reagan, and this was my 4th Naomi Reagan book, and I just love Naomi Reagan, and it's about sisters and an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in the 1950s and the 60s, and how one of the sisters remains pious and pure and true, and one of them gets shunned and pursues a career in photography and a life all her own, and how these sisters, they're related and they're sisters. They never quite stop being influential and part of each other's lives. What was my favorite part of the book is the question that I pulled. The writing is my favorite part of the book. I love Naomi Reagan's writing. It is so evocative, and she's writing about things and culture that I just have never experienced myself, but I feel like I have a clear understanding of how culture and society, which is so foreign to me, is really impacting these characters. And the characters feel like real people, real round characters who make mistakes and do terrible things, but also do really wonderful things and make great choices. Like, I love her character development and her storytelling, how much I learn about people from reading her book. And then I have 2 books that at the time of recording, I am not quite done with yet, but am well into. And so I will mention them here, but not answer a question about them. And they are On the Night of the Seventh Moon by Victoria Holt and Hamnet and Judith by Maggie O'Farrell. This is, of course, Hamnet, but I have the Canadian copy of it. It is called Hamnet and Judith in this printing for whatever reason. What I'm really loving about Hamnet and Judith is how lyrical the writing is. It's just absolutely some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read. This is a holdover from my February TBR, and while I'm sad it took me so long to get to it, like, I'm really glad that I'm reading it. It's just so beautiful, but I also think it's going to rip my heart out. I'm apprehensive. And then The Night of the Seventh Moon by Victoria Holt. I've realized I have not read this one. And what I'm enjoying about this one is just how weird it is. It's like it reads like a fever dream about fairy tales. It feels like watching a B-movie horror film made in the 1970s. I didn't realize that it took place in the 1800s. I thought it was going to take place in the 60s or the 70s, but it takes place in the 1800s. And it's about a girl whose mother is from the Black Forest. So she goes to the same convent school that her mother went to, and she gets lost on a hillside one day and roped into a relationship with a mysterious robber baron. And it's weird. It is a weird book. And I can't read a lot of it at one sitting because, I don't know, it's so, I'm interested and I'm drawn in, but I'm also held at arm's length with it. It's like, I'm not going to sit down and read 20 Grimm's fairy tales in a row. It feels kind of like that. Like, I'm satisfied after a chapter. I'm done. I need to take a break. I need to read something else. But I'm really enjoying it, and it's making me want to try to track down some of the Victoria Holts that I actually did read when I was a teen and reread them. This was very long, and I am sorry. But it was also just Mary Shelley May knocked it out of the park. So good. And I have wonderful high expectations for Library Duel June. And I'm really excited because at the time of recording this, I have 15 teaching days left before my summer vacation. 20 days of work left because we have a week of meetings afterwards. But it's almost summertime, and I think there's big changes coming my way in the next couple of weeks, which I will talk to you about eventually. But in the meantime, let's just go read.